Thanks very much. I would like to say happy to talk about Brexit, but never really happy about talking about Brexit. Although from a perspective of someone working in a think tank, from the perspective of analysis, Brexit is a very interesting phenomenon. It's something which I think has many, I wouldn't say lessons, but it has many ideas which we also need to apply to other areas. And I hope to come back to that in the lecture. But I want to start with, because I think it's important to be clear about it, that I think Brexit is a terrible idea. It has always been a terrible idea. There are, in my view, no benefits from Brexit whatsoever. And that has been something which I've believed from the beginning. My son, who's half British, he asked me within a few hours of the Brexit referendum what had happened and why people were upset. And he then asked me the question, but why would anybody do that? I've still struggled with that question to this day. So that is my background, and I think it's important to be open about that. So you will not hear very many positive things about Brexit from me. Brexit is also a phenomenon where I think in the context of differentiation, we have to be very clear that it is different than anything else we have seen before. It's differentiated disintegration with a strong emphasis on divergence from the country leaving the European Union. That makes the whole process also in its impact very different than any other process of differentiated integration that we've had. And so far, it is really the only example of this kind of process, and I'll come back to the uniqueness of it. But I want to start a bit, and apologies for those who've experienced this before, but I think it's important to go through the history and particularly through the politics of Brexit before going into some of the analytical depth, because it has always been my belief that process like this you cannot understand without the political economy behind it. And the reason why we have ended up with the kind of Brexit we have now has a lot to do, in particular, with UK politics. And that will be a theme I will come back to a number of times. So how did we get to a referendum on EU membership? We have had a combination of a long-term issue with EU membership in the UK. EU membership has been contested in the UK for a long time, in part because political elites in the UK on all sides of the spectrum never fully bought into the political union part of the European Union. But we also had a tremendous miscalculation by the Conservative Party and David Cameron in particular. The idea was that the Conservative Party has had these conflicts on Europe for decades, essentially with a strong right-wing Eurosceptic wing, which tended to be in the minority, fighting very vocally against a pragmatic wing. So a wing within the Conservative Party which was never very happy with the European Union, but decided that on economic balance it is better to be in than to be outside. And the idea some people in the Conservative Party had is the best way of resolving this kind of issue is by having a referendum, and that would put the issue to rest, in part also because there was the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, which returned a no to Scottish independence. So there was this idea that this would settle the position of the UK, and it would stop the civil war within the Conservative Party. As part of that, there was an almost forgotten episode now, that David Cameron, when he had announced the referendum, then decided that there would have to be a renegotiation with the European Union about the membership of the UK. Note, this was not about reforms to the European Union. This was very specifically only for the UK, which also meant that from an EU perspective, effectively there was very little which could be on the table, because you cannot end up with a package which simply fulfills the needs of one member state, because clearly all the other member states will then ask, what about their package, what about their grievances? But this was also part of David Cameron's miscalculation, because during the period when he negotiated this non-packet, he did not campaign for staying in the European Union. He did not impose any kind of discipline on his party, which meant that a number of people then decided from the Conservative Party to be part of the Leave campaigns. And for, I would say, around 4 or 5 months, the whole debate in the UK was only dominated by Leave, was only dominated by the negative scare stories, the lies which were being told by the Leave campaign. And we know that they are lies. This has been proven many times, but ultimately they were what was in people's head when they went in the end to make their decision 6 years ago. In that, we also had the civil war within the Conservative Party, where Boris Johnson, a character we will return to, decided on purely tactical grounds that he would back the Leave campaign. We know that because we know he was a columnist at the time, and we know he wrote 2 different columns, one which was for Remain and one which was for Leave, and he only chose at the last moment which one he would go with. Sometimes, and you will find that later on in the lecture as well, all of this sounds a little bit strange. It sounds a bit like conspiracy theories, but unfortunately everything I'm going to say, I think there is ample evidence for it. Boris Johnson is a notorious liar. He has been a liar for a very long time, and he's been proven to be a liar on various occasions. He's lost jobs over it, and he continues, unfortunately, to do exactly that at this moment in time, but I'll come back to that. So in the end, because of these dynamics, we did have a narrow vote, 52 to 48, to leave the European Union, without any idea and without any debate really in the UK about what does it actually mean to leave the European Union. And that then ended in a period of, I would say, complete chaos within British politics. David Cameron resigned, recognizing that in the end he couldn't stay in his post, but he didn't even take responsibility. He didn't deal with any of the aftermath. He just left. So the Conservative Party then had to decide on a new leader, and in the end chose Theresa May, who had been the Home Secretary, so responsible in particular for migration, and that was an obsession in the Conservative Party in general, and with Theresa May in particular, and that then determined also some of the outcomes later on. But ultimately, what we saw essentially was disunity. We saw that the UK was completely unclear about what the process was going to be, where the UK was going to go, how the negotiations would be conducted. And to go into any form of negotiation without a clear outcome in mind is a very dangerous game. What was remarkable was that at the same time on the EU side, all of these things did not happen. And that was what many people expected. Many people expected that the EU would be disunited, that the EU would not know how to handle this process, that in the end, and some of this now sounds, with hindsight, rather unrealistic, but at the time, the UK civil service was known to be some of the best negotiators in the world. There was an expectation that the UK would be a strong negotiator, would be very good at divide and conquer, would be able to bring some countries on their side. And none of that happened. In part because we invented a new method of dealing with this disintegration. I've called it the Barnier method. You can call it whatever you like. The difference to previous methods is really the integration, which was achieved by having a chief negotiator who was very closely working with all the institutions and the member states. And the member states essentially were very happy to give the whole responsibility of the negotiations with the United Kingdom to the Barnier team. Of course, it wasn't just him, it was a whole mechanism. But there was also a political realization in all of the member states that whatever sympathies you might have for the UK was now in the process of becoming a third country. And that meant that ultimately it was no longer in the interest of the member states to make compromises with the UK over and above their relationship with other member states. That was a shock for the UK. The UK didn't expect this. There was a trip, I remember, of Theresa May, where she went to 4 or 5 capitals, where she expected to get a rather positive reception. Countries like Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands. And she was told in no uncertain terms that not only was the EU united on this, but that there would be no special concessions for the UK in the process. For years, people in the UK and the media in the UK didn't believe this was going to happen, but that's exactly what happened in the end. And in part, this was also because some of the smaller member states were very afraid that countries like Germany or France could cut a deal with the UK, which would protect their interests over and above the interests of the smaller member states. And the one member state which was particularly concerned about this was Ireland, because Ireland clearly had more skin in the game than any other country, not only because of its economic interrelation with the UK, with a very strong still connection between the Irish economy and the British economy, but also because of the unique problem of Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland essentially has been the biggest stumbling block in the negotiations, because essentially to get to peace in Northern Ireland, we have rightly created a fudge. We created a fudge whereby people in Northern Ireland didn't have to decide whether they belonged to the UK or whether they belonged to Ireland, but they could live in a space where both was possible at the same time. That no longer worked, in particular because the economic choice Theresa May made, and I'm still to this day not sure whether it could not have been different. And this is a big what-if question. But she announced in a speech in very clear terms that the UK would leave the single market and would leave the customs union. And the moment that was announced, the Northern Ireland problem became immensely more difficult. If we had essentially kept the same regulatory regime in the UK as we had in the EU, then we wouldn't have a lot of the friction which is there at the moment. That's not to say there wouldn't be friction, there would still be problems, but it would be of a different magnitude than what we have at this moment in time. And in part, the reason for leaving the single market was exactly going back to the migration point, that freedom of movement was seen, freedom of movement of people was seen as one of the key benefits from Brexit. It had to be ended, and that meant leaving the single market in the minds of the British, well, mainly the Conservative Party. So we had the Northern Ireland problem. How do you ensure that there's no border, no land border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, while at the same time protecting the integrity of the single market? Theresa May, in the end, negotiated a deal by which we would have the so-called backstop, which essentially meant if no other solution could be found, then the UK would stay in the regulatory regime of the EU. That was rejected by Westminster repeatedly. So in the end, Theresa May had to resign, or at least in normal times, if you get a result in a vote of confidence which is not very convincing, you resign. Of course, that doesn't apply to Boris Johnson, but she did resign in a rather bitter way because she felt that she was being betrayed by her party. She had negotiated a deal which was then not carried. But Boris Johnson then came to power essentially on the promise of getting Brexit done, in a way already implying that you would get Brexit done in any way possible. It didn't really matter how you got it over the line. So the first real issue which had to be addressed, also because the EU had been very clear about sequencing. You have to resolve the issues of withdrawal first, Northern Ireland, the rights of citizens in the UK, EU citizens in the UK, and the question of finances. So he had to get some form of deal with, in particular, Ireland on how to resolve the Northern Ireland question. And that was, in the end, done by agreeing that essentially, and technically it's much more complicated, but essentially Northern Ireland stays in the single market, and you have some checks and controls to ensure the integrity of the single market, which take place in the Irish Sea rather than on the land border anywhere. This was the deal which Boris Johnson negotiated, signed up, and he was fully aware that this was going to be the effect of the deal. Everybody knew what this implied. So coming back to the theme of Boris Johnson lying, the idea that somehow this is now different than what they expected on the UK side is simply not true. They knew perfectly well what they were signing up to. But that agreement then also opened the space for negotiation on the long-term relationship between the EU and the UK. That negotiation took place very rapidly. We had far less time for the deal than any other trade negotiation in, I think, probably in history, certainly in recent history. And that also meant that many issues could not be addressed, but in the end, if you listen to the political rhetoric in the UK, the idea was to have a deal which was rather thin, which essentially focused on tariff-free trade. It essentially focused on goods, with many of the other issues, again, which now the UK is complaining about, but which were very clear from the beginning, not being addressed. Essentially, it was emphasizing sovereignty and divergence over economic cooperation and a common regime, which means this kind of Brexit is, in economic terms, pretty close to the worst kind of Brexit you can have. It's not as bad as having no deal at all. Clearly there's a benefit from having an agreement, but it doesn't go anywhere far enough when you look at the intricate relationship, the supply chains, the kind of issues which you have in international trade in any case, but with a country which is so closely integrated into the European economy in particular. And this is creating a number of economic problems in the UK. It continues to accumulate problems. When you look at the discussion around the economic effect of Brexit, the key discussion for me is the one around dynamic benefits, not static benefits. They are, dynamic costs rather than static costs. They are very significant static costs. We're talking about, depending on the different estimates, and it's very hard to tell with COVID happening at the same time, but we're probably talking about 5-6% of GDP. But when you look at the dynamic costs, in particular, also the cost of losing the inward migration, which has been extremely important for the British economy, the long-term costs are much greater, and this is one of the reasons why when you look at forecasts for the British economy at this moment in time, they are rather disastrous. But this economic cost, again, was known. There's no real doubt about that if you are disintegrating a market, you get exactly the opposite effect from integrating a market. So integrating a market will give you greater scale, it will give you greater efficiency. Disintegrating does the opposite, so it costs. And that was the choice taken, that ultimately sovereignty was more important than economics by a long way. So if you look at the Brexit process, you have to understand it as a political process, not an economic one. Economically, it makes no sense whatsoever. And that, I think, is continuing to be the case. Where are we now? We are in a situation where the UK continues to create friction, political and economic friction, in particular on Northern Ireland. It's not the only issue, but that is the particular focus, where the UK has now put a bill on the floor of the House of Commons to disapply parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol, supposedly in the argumentation of the UK government to save the Good Friday Agreement, in reality to create political problems and to hold on to power for Boris Johnson. This is a breach of international law, and no matter how many lawyers on the British side are making intellectual contortions, in the end it is very clear. You sign up to an international treaty. If you then disapply parts of that without the consent of the other party, you're breaching that treaty, which is breaching international law. This is a threat at the moment. It hasn't passed through the House of Commons. It will also be held up in the House of Lords if it gets to that point in time. But the intention is very clear. And what has also come out over the last month is that we now know without any doubt that the UK negotiated in bad faith, that they had no intention of implementing what they signed up to. A number of the people who were directly involved in the process have said so also in public. So where are we going to go from here? It's not going to get better. At best, my view is, but you'll hear later on maybe a more positive view, but my view is at best it will continue like this. It will continue to be extremely difficult, but there will be no resolution, because it's not about achieving a resolution for the UK government. It's about internal political processes which are not stopping. At worst, I think they could get to an internal process which leads in the end to putting the whole trade and cooperation agreement in question. While I think it is still less likely, or certainly in the short term, there is a possibility that this might happen. So that comes back to the point I made about this is a unique process. It's essentially, from the beginning, it has been a process which has been about cost, about disbenefits, rather than finding a way of integrating to have some common benefits for all those involved. There has always been, and that I think is part of the reason why we are seeing this kind of political chaos in the UK, there's always been a big distributional question about who is going to bear this cost, particularly in the UK. That's not to say there are no costs for the EU. There are significant costs for the EU from this process. Brexit has always been a lose-lose proposition, but the costs are far more significant on the UK side, and they're far harder to mitigate against because you no longer have the large market in which you can actually reorient your business. There has been an attempt in the UK to reorient to the global markets, but economics tells us that this will only be of limited use. You always trade much more with countries in your proximity than with countries around the world. So this process, in my view, doesn't serve as an example for how you can differentiate when it comes to integration, because it is a negative process. But nevertheless, there are a number of things I think we can learn from the process. I think that makes it very interesting also to apply it to some of the questions we have on the table now. I think the EU, unlike the UK, has moved on from Brexit, quite significantly, but there are actually lessons we can learn. One lesson I would come back to is what I mentioned about the method of negotiating. For me, there's a question whether this kind of method cannot be used also in other areas of negotiation. Having a chief negotiator who has also a technical and a political role, having this very close relationship between the institutions, and in particular having the Commission reporting very, very closely also to the European Council, having a very transparent process, being very clear about the overarching objectives, strategic objectives of the process were set by the EU right at the beginning of the process, and they carried through right to the end. So I think there are many things we can learn about processes and how we design these kind of negotiations, potentially also applying this to other areas, not just negotiations with third countries, but also if we have to achieve a major strategic objective. I think another effect which Brexit has highlighted, at least for those who have had the misfortune of being involved in it, is that the framework of the European Union, including its laws, its conventions, its protection of democracy, are actually much more significant and much more important than we sometimes give it credit to. What we see, at least in my view, is very often that there's a focus on the problem areas. So Hungary, Poland, and the issues we have there. And I'm not trying in any way to minimize those problems. The question is, how bad would they be outside the European Union? And I think what we can see in the UK, and I'm saying that with quite a heavy heart, because I think it is not very positive to watch a country going through this process. I think what we are seeing in the UK is a significant weakening of democracy, a significant weakening of institutions, which continues on a daily basis. And I think this is partially an impact of Brexit. It is about withdrawing some of those controlling factors which are there, often not very visible. It is also an effect of Brexit bringing populists to power, who are testing British democracy to destruction at the moment. And I know this sounds very dramatic, but I think when you actually see what is happening in terms of now, for example, a discussion around withdrawing from the European Convention of Human Rights, or effectively withdrawing, putting a law into place. This seems to be the new fashion in the UK. You put a law into place which says if we disagree with what the European Court of Human Rights decides, then we can disapply it, which effectively means you're withdrawing from it. That is a stunning thing to do for any country, even for those countries where democracy is very shaky, so that the UK is even thinking about this, is even thinking about breaking international law, is thinking about having a number of things happening around Parliament and around the executive. It is entirely ignoring also the parts of the UK which are not in agreement with the route which is being taken. So I think democracy in the UK is in trouble, and it shows, in my view, that the European Union is also a stabilizing factor, is also important for the overall democratic fabric of a country. I think what is also important is that we have had some changes to the EU from Brexit. I did say the EU has moved on, and I think that is obvious when you actually see nobody really focuses on the UK anymore. But there have been some changes. Yes, there's the overall change in terms of the weight of the EU, how important is it in the world, where I would say that the current situation does highlight that, in particular when it comes to security and defense, the UK is still a very important European actor, and not having the UK in has an effect, but it is not just a negative effect. I think it is also important to recognize that the long-term trajectory, which I talked about at the beginning of the UK, has meant that the UK has been not just reluctant, but has effectively vetoed movement in a number of different areas. In particular in security and defense, where the UK has not seen a role for the EU at all. So I think any kind of movement we will see in the next month and years about defense and security is only possible because the UK is no longer a member, but also in areas, for example, like budget. We had the Resilience and Recovery Fund, which is for the first time borrowing at EU level. There is, in my view, no way we would have had that if the UK had been at the table at that moment in time. So there are big changes. One of the changes which some people feared was that the EU would become more dominated by France and Germany. You take out one of the big countries. In my view, that hasn't happened. Not necessarily because it hasn't changed the power balance. Of course it has. For some of the smaller countries, this, particularly the ones which were usually allied with the UK on policy areas, this is now difficult. It's more difficult to get heard, more difficult to push things through. So for the Netherlands, for the Nordics, this is a loss which has been felt. In some policy areas, we are much weaker than we were before. We certainly are missing, for example, UK expertise on financial services, on some of the technologies. But in the end, when you look at how the EU has reacted, it has been essentially adapted rather quickly and rather well. So the impact, and I think this is going to be the persistent long-term effect, is that it will continue to rip the UK apart. It will continue to be the biggest single issue for the UK for a very long time to come. Whereas for the EU, yes, we have to deal with Northern Ireland, but it is really about the longer-term trajectory and dealing with the challenges we face now. But there is a question, and I think I'll finish on that because it's also not something which can be decided at this moment in time. But there is a big question now about how do we deal with our neighborhood? How do we deal with applicant countries who want to join the European Union? How do we deal with countries which might want to be closely integrated with the European Union but not be a member state? Or those countries which want to be a member state but are nowhere ready to become a member state in the near future? So we will have to rethink the whole area of enlargement, neighborhood policies, relations with third countries in our neighborhood. I think the conclusion I would have at this stage is that it cannot stay the same as it has been up to now. This will be a very difficult debate, but in my view, we cannot be in a situation where we give up certain areas of Europe to the influence of China and Russia. We cannot continue to do that, which we have done, unfortunately, in the Western Balkans. We cannot not give an answer to Ukraine, and I think it is a good thing that we are now moving towards candidate status. But then the question is, what comes next? How do you then design a process of further integration, further institutional development, so that Ukraine can actually become a member? What do we do with countries like Moldova? What do we do with the Caucasus countries, in particular Georgia? How do we deal with Turkey? How do we deal with the UK? How do we deal with the European Economic Area countries? These are all big questions, and I think Brexit can teach us some things, but it certainly isn't an example anyone should follow. Thank you.